Namaskar, Anyong Hasanika. Welcome back to day 6 of our workshop on Facets of Modern India, a truly masterclass of ideas of India, I must say, by top class, best and brightest minds from India. We have series of brainstorming sessions and excellent panel lined up in the coming days on issues related to strategic culture, democracy, disarmament, and disaster management, all leading by experts in their own domain to give you glimpses of modern India on this virtual platform. I'm especially delighted to share that Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center at Embassy of India in Seoul, under the dynamic leadership of our ambassador and her team, has been a pioneer, in fact, a first in starting this truly intellectual enterprise. The sole mission is to develop a rich and nuanced understanding of modern India, the civilization, the state in all its diverse manifestations amongst audiences abroad that always wanted to know more and more about India. We started the workshop on 1st of September with the inaugural address by President of Indian Council of Cultural Relations, Dr. Vinay Sahasrabudhe, on the idea of India. Day 2 of the workshop witnessed the special lecture by Professor Makarand Paranjape, Director of Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, on Indian philosophical traditions. On day 3, we had an informative description on the National Education Policy 2020 by Professor Rishikesh Senapati, Director of NCERT. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairman at RIS, gave a brilliant exposition of Indian economy in transition, along with the challenges of the Indian growth model and India's economic diplomacy in a post-COVID world on day 4 of the workshop. Ms. Indrani Bagchi, diplomatic editor of the Times of India, in her lecture yesterday, gave an overview of the growth and evolution of media industry in India and the challenges thereof. All the lectures are on our social media handles, and you can go back to them for any future reference. Let us now begin with today's special lecture, which will be followed by open house discussion and live interaction by the participants. I'm extremely honored to have amongst us Ambassador TCA Raghavan, who is the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, which is a premier think tank. And he's joining us live here from New Delhi, along with the presence of Her Excellency Sri Priya Ranganathan, Ambassador of India to Republic of Korea, for today's special lecture on Indian foreign policy. With these words, may I now call upon Ambassador Sri Priya Ranganathan for her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
It's such a pleasure to welcome Ambassador Raghavan, DG of the ICWA, for this very, very important session of our lecture series on the topic of India's foreign policy. I think we cannot have a better person to speak to us about this, given the kind of experience and expertise and command which Ambassador Raghavan has over the world of Indian diplomacy. And I personally am really, really excited and looking forward to the lecture. And I can only thank him for being so kind with his time and his knowledge and his willingness to spend this hour and a half with us. And I'm totally confident that our friends in Korea are going to not only enjoy this session, but are also going to understand much better about the fundamentals of Indian foreign policy as a result of this. I'm looking forward to a very, very insightful and incisive lecture, and to a very robust Q&A following that. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your remarks. We now move over to the invited speaker for today, Ambassador TCA Raghavan, who is the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs since July 2018. He retired from the Indian Foreign Service in December 2015 while Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan. He had earlier served as the High Commissioner to Singapore. During his posting in New Delhi in the Ministry of External Affairs, Ambassador Raghavan was Joint Secretary dealing with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. He has also served in Kuwait, the United Kingdom, and Bhutan. He was awarded PhD by Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1992 for his dissertation relating to the economic history of India. His current interests are historical research, strategic analysis, and the diplomatic and intellectual history of modern India. He writes, lectures, and participates in discussions on issues relating to Indian and South Asian diplomatic history, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, and Southeast Asia. He brings his years of solid diplomatic experience into narrating the diplomatic history of India, and not to forget his deep literary insights and outlook on contemporary foreign policy debates too. Let us hear, sir, to your special lecture on Indian foreign policy and your views on continuity and changes in the foreign policy dispensations over the years. We also look forward to your views on the people next door, as your book is aptly titled. It is a personal pleasure and delight to welcome you once again and look forward to your insights. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ranganathan. I'm also grateful to the Vivekananda Center for Cultural Relations and to Sonu Trivedi for having invited me. Ambassador, congratulations, first of all, on this wonderful initiative. And I'm delighted that I have the opportunity to address so many interested participants from South Korea and elsewhere on the subject of continuity and change in Indian foreign policy. Now, the subject is obviously a vast one, and there are many aspects to which, which probably separate lectures, if not separate seminars, could be devoted. So I'll try to give an overview of how India situates itself in the world and how India sees the world. But even so, there will be large areas which I will not be able to touch upon. And it's not because they are not important to Indian foreign policy. They are, in fact, they take up a very large space in our worldview and in our foreign policy perspective. But there are large areas such as our relations with Africa, our relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, which I will touch on only peripherally. Similarly, I don't intend to go into any details about India's relations with South Korea. That is a very rich and separate field in itself. And I'm sure Ambassador Ranganathan will have been addressing it from time to time. But certainly in India, there is this great sense of affinity with South Korea. And a great deal of that affinity derives from a civilizational link. All of you are aware of the relationship in historical times between the city of Ayodhya and Korean history. There are more recent evidences which bring forward that civilizational connect. But as I said, I don't wish to go into the details of India-South Korea relations, except to touch on it from time to time when the subject comes up. My aim today is to give a bird's eye view or an overview of some of the central themes which underwrite Indian foreign policy. Let me begin with talking a little bit about what is the principal objective of Indian foreign policy. And that principal objective can be summed up very, very simply in terms of a domestic objective, which is how do we get an external environment which enables all-round social and economic development for our citizens and for our people. India is, as you know, a large and diverse country. We are a developing economy. We therefore need an external environment that is conducive to rapid economic development. How to secure that external environment is really the principal challenge and the principal task ahead of Indian foreign policy. And that is something in which there is a fundamental continuity from the time we gained independence. There have been many other changes in Indian foreign policy, but certainly one principal objective which has remained unchanging is that how do we secure an external environment which is conducive to our domestic economic development. Now, when we talk about Indian foreign policy, it's also possible to see certain very deep background influences which operate in it and have operated in it for a long period of time since we gained our independence. The most important of which is that India does not have an imperial tradition. It is foreign to our thinking of having an imperial martial tradition like many countries have had. We have had no colonial conquests in the sense that they are normally understood. But at the same time, we are a state which is also civilizational. And therefore, our influence has been very widespread in our entire region and in the wider world around us. But as I said, it was never a history, we have never had a history of colonization, of colonial conquests. Our influence has always been cultural and intellectual. This is a very important point to remember when we talk about background influences on Indian foreign policy. The second very important influence is something which is more recent, which is our own colonial background and history of freedom struggle to establish a sovereign and independent country. This also operates as a background factor throughout in our foreign policy approach. From that history of fighting against colonialism, of having a very rich and varied tradition of independent thinking, all of which was part of our freedom struggle, certain other elements have come out. The most important of which are a tradition of non-alignment, of solidarity with fellow developing countries, Afro-Asian solidarity. So these three or four factors, the absence of an imperial tradition, but at the same time being a civilizational state, a long history of Indian influence, cultural and intellectual influence, projecting outwards, a colonial background, the history of a freedom struggle, a sense of solidarity with other developing countries, non-alignment. These are all background influences which continue to remain in our foreign policy thinking, although of course there have been very important subsequent developments which play a more direct influence in our foreign policy approach. Now, the second point to remember is about when we talk about foreign policy is India's geography and geographical location. And here I just wish to show you for a brief period a slide which shows India's geographical location. Let me just get that slide onto the screen so you will know what I am trying to say. Now, when you look at the location of India today, two things immediately stand out. And these two things are our vast continental neighborhood. And by continental neighborhood, I mean the landmass which is to the west and north of India. This vast area which comprises currently the Russian Federation, Central Asia, China, our immediate neighborhood, which is Pakistan, Afghanistan, the region to the west of us, which is Iran, Iraq, the Gulf states, the region to the east of us, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the whole of the Southeast Asian landmass. By this, I mean our continental neighborhood. At the same time, we have this vast maritime neighborhood, which is the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean linking up through the South China Sea with the Pacific Ocean, the landmass of Africa, which is connected to us by the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. All of this really is our continental neighborhood. And the most important thing to remember about India, when we look at its foreign policy, is this constant dialectic or constant interface between the maritime and the continental. And this really is a driving factor in Indian foreign policy. It has been through history, and it is very much of an ever-present factor today. The second point to remember about India when we talk about its foreign policy is the size and the diversity of the country. We are a country which is multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multicultural in a word. Now, what is the impact of that in terms of our foreign policy? It has a very, very immediate impact when we look at our neighborhood. We share common languages with many of our immediate neighbors. Many of the official languages of India are international languages like Tamil and others. But the diversity of India is a fundamental point to remember when we talk about our foreign policy, especially when it comes to our foreign policy in our immediate neighborhood. So when we look at our neighborhood, and by our immediate neighborhood, I mean South Asia, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia, it goes without saying that the most challenging issues before any country's diplomacy and foreign policy is how it conducts relations with its neighbors. Now, in our immediate neighborhood, we have Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and these really comprise South Asia as we know it today. Each of these relationships, these neighboring country relationships, is something on which we can have a separate lecture or a separate discussion on, because each is a separate universe in itself, and each has its own uniqueness and its own history. Possibly we can go into it when we discuss it in greater details, but very briefly, our relations with Pakistan have in our immediate neighborhood been the most challenging. There are many reasons for this, but let me begin with the premise which I mentioned earlier, that neighboring country relationships pose the greatest challenge in any country's diplomacy. If you look at your own neighborhood from Seoul, you will understand what I am trying to say, because there are different issues of history, both recent and not so recent history, issues of identity, issues of strategic trust and mistrust, issues of, these are all issues which underwrite current diplomacy. And certainly in terms of our relations with Pakistan, each of these factors has played a major role. But when we look at our immediate neighborhood, it's also useful to remember how much India's relations with its immediate neighbors has been shaped by external factors and by wider geopolitical changes. So if you look at the situation in South Asia today, it's useful to look back at earlier periods of our history when wider geopolitical changes had an immediate impact on India's relations with many of its neighbors. So one year, for instance, which comes to mind when we look at wider geopolitical changes impacting India's immediate neighborhood policy is 1979. Why is 1979 important? Because in 1979, a number of very important changes took place more or less at the same time. 1979 is the year of the revolution in Iran. It is the year of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. It is the year in which you see Islamic radicalism emerging in Saudi Arabia, and this was exemplified by Islamic radicals taking over the Grand Mosque at Mecca. 1979 is also the year in which the forces of democracy received a decisive setback with the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. 1979, incidentally, is also the year in which you see the beginnings of globalization as we understand it, or as we call it today, with the election of Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, the election of President Reagan as President of the United States, and these two individuals really typified that drive towards globalization, which soon enveloped a large part of the world. 1979 is also the year in which you see the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, and the beginning of a long phase of international history in which it was felt that the growth of China will enable a further impetus being given to the forces of globalization. So it's a very significant year from an international perspective also. 1979 is also a year which saw very, very important changes in our eastern neighborhood, with a brief Chinese-Vietnamese border conflict. So all these factors which took place in 1979 had an immediate impact on on India's relations with its neighbors. The other year which comes to mind when we look at significant periods of history impacting Indian foreign policy is 1989. 1989 is the year in which the Berlin Wall came down, in which the disintegration of the Soviet Union became very evident and very visible. It was also the year in which the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was completed. More than anything else, 1979 marked the end of the Cold War in Europe and possibly in many other parts of the world. It's also the year in which China underwent a great deal of internal convulsions through the form of Tiananmen Square and other developments. Each of these had an immediate impact on the way India looked at the world. And certainly each of these factors had an impact also on our relations with Pakistan. But as I said, neighboring country relationships are often very, very difficult. And certainly with Pakistan, we have had a suboptimal relationship for a long period of time. And we are currently still in that suboptimal phase, and I'll come to that as to why this is so. But very briefly, it is because of the fact of terrorism and the fact that there is a certain climate of opinion in Pakistan which believes that using terrorists or using terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy is something which is in their interest, and that leads to a very definite downturn in relations with India. But when we look at India and its immediate neighborhood, two other points come to mind, and these are two different approaches to regional cooperation. Firstly, SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and BIMSTEC, which is a more maritime perspective. And BIMSTEC is an organization comprising of Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Thailand, Nepal, Bhutan, and it is more focused towards our east. Now, this duality between SAARC and BIMSTEC is often discussed, but essentially, SAARC was not able to be as effective as an instrument of regional cooperation, principally because of certain obstructionist positions which were taken by Pakistan from time to time. BIMSTEC in that sense is a more effective platform and a more effective vehicle for furthering regional cooperation, especially when it comes to our uh, eastern neighbors. I'll also touch briefly on the situation to our north and to our west, which is the situation in Afghanistan, because again, that has a very important role to play when we talk about Indian foreign policy. In Afghanistan today, after 35 years of civil war, there is a sense of exhaustion. At the same time, we have seen the United States intervention over there, and there are many signs that that intervention is now coming to an end. It is the longest military intervention of the United States in its history. And as that intervention comes to an end, there are questions about where is Afghanistan headed. Now, that is a question which interests us greatly in India and certainly makes up a very important chunk of Indian foreign policy today. Similarly, there is the situation with, there is the question of Iran. Iran and India are civilizational states. We have relations which go deep back into history. But at the same time, our relationship with Iran has been affected a great deal by the breakdown of relations between Iran and the United States. So while we have a certain commonality of approach with Iran on many issues, the fact that Iran-US relations and Iran's relations with many other countries have not been stable have also had an impact on India's relations with that country. When we look at our Western neighborhood, and especially when we talk about continuity and change in Indian foreign policy, the one big change which has taken place is in our relations with the Gulf states. Now, again, it is not as if our relations with the Gulf state do not have a long and rich history of cooperation. We do. We have had relations with the Gulf through the Arabian Sea for the millennium. In the last 50, 60 years, a large number of Indians were living and working in the Gulf, contributing to the economic development of these states, but also being very important for India in terms of the remittances we received from them. What has changed in the past few years is a qualitatively new relationship which is emerging between India and Saudi Arabia and other states in the Gulf. And this is a more strategic and political proximity which has developed in our worldview. So when we look at change in Indian foreign policy, I think this new proximity and a new commonality of worldview between India and the Gulf is certainly something which is to be borne in mind. When we look to our east, you have the whole of Southeast Asia. Since the early 1990s, India has embarked on a look east policy. A look east policy meant trying to reinforce and further strengthen our relations with the ASEAN countries, and further to the east with countries such as Japan, South Korea, and others. Now, why did this look east or policy come about? It obviously was related to the wider changes which were taking place internationally, and in particular, the end of the Cold War, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and most importantly, perhaps, the fact that those two changes coincided with major changes in the Indian economy, which is our opening up of the economy, trying to make India an attractive destination for external capital, as also trying to develop our own export orientation where industry is concerned. So from the 1990s, look east became a very, very important segment of Indian foreign policy. About 4 or 5 years ago, Look East was further transformed by the government now saying that we should not just be looking east, we should be acting east. And this meant a further strengthening and cementing and reinforcing of our relations with ASEAN, with South Korea, with Japan, and generally with our eastern neighborhood in the widest possible sense. From this perspective of acting east, another new concept in Indian foreign policy emerged, and this was a maritime view of the world, which is today summarized very briefly in terms of very briefly by being called the Indo-Pacific. What is new about the Indo-Pacific? The Indo-Pacific really is a maritime perspective which India has come to have about the external world. Why is it new? It is not new in the sense that India has traditionally also been, apart from being a continental nation and having relations with Central Asia, with all its continental neighbors, which I had pointed to when I showed you the map earlier. But a maritime perspective was always part of Indian history. When you travel to Cambodia, you travel to Vietnam, you travel to Indonesia, you see many signs of a deep and sustained interaction between South Asia and these countries and these regions. And this has a 2 millennium long history. So in that sense, India has always been a maritime nation, having a maritime perspective. But certainly that perspective was weakened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s because we were much more concentrated on looking at our continental neighbors, our land, the neighbors with whom we had a land boundary. From acting east, but most significantly from acting from looking east to acting east, this maritime perspective has now come to the center of our radar screen, and this is really summarized in terms of being called the Indo-Pacific, which is really that what this really means that there is a fundamental unity between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and India's perspective is therefore that our maritime universe extends from the east coast of Africa all the way to the ends of the Pacific Ocean, because this is how historically India interacted with its maritime universe. Is this new? It is new in terms of conceptual thinking where modern Indian foreign policy is concerned. But it is not new if you look at 2 millennium of history, and I had referred to India's contacts with Vietnam, India's contacts with Indonesia, India's contacts with the Malaysian peninsula, and so on, because it shows a great intensity of cultural and commercial and intellectual links beginning from the first and second century of our era. Similarly, when you look to our west, our relations with the eastern coast of Africa, and when you realize that these are not relations which emerged in the last 50, 60 years, but again have been there for 2 millennium. Similarly, our relations with the Arab countries really go back to the early centuries of the current era, at least 2000 years. So from these perspectives, from this historical understanding of India as a civilizational entity, much before it became a nation state, this idea, this maritime perspective of India, which we now call the Indo-Pacific, emerged. Now, this is an external perspective of how India views the world, but it is also very much a domestic perspective that India has to fully participate in the development of its coastal states. And if you remember in the map, we have a long and varied coastline, both in the east and in the west, along the Arabian Sea and along the Bay of Bengal. And our Prime Minister really articulated this maritime perspective by talking about SAGAR. SAGAR really is an acronym which stands for Security and Growth for All, but it is also a Sanskrit word which means the oceans. So this Indo-Pacific idea as a way of articulating a maritime perspective for India is now a very important part of Indian foreign policy thinking, and certainly it marks a new phase of Indian foreign policy thinking, and to that extent is a big change from thinking, let's say 50 years or 40 years ago. Let me come to another aspect of our worldview, or of our Indian foreign policy worldview, which is the question of terrorism, and I referred briefly to that when I was talking about Pakistan. But certainly our perspective on terrorism is a very important insight into Indian foreign policy, and it makes up a significant part of our foreign policy thinking. Why is that so? Because we have been a major victim of terrorism, and major acts of terrorism across the world have had a significant impact on India itself. It is 19 years or so since the terrorist attack in the United States, popularly called 9/11, but it's also 12 years since a major terrorist attack in the city of Mumbai, which we call 26/11. So how we can create an international climate of opinion which enables a platform that will not tolerate acts of terrorism or support for terrorist groups or support for terrorist ideologies and ways of thinking, is a very important part of how we approach Indian foreign policy. There have been major developments in this regard. For instance, the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF, the different committees of the UN which impose sanctions on individuals who are connected to terrorist activities. But at the same time, it is certainly the case that the international action on this particular aspect has not been as much as we would have liked. Although this has been under discussion for at least 2 decades, perhaps longer, the international community has still not been able to finalize a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. And to that extent, this is a major lacuna in multilateral approaches to this issue so far. I think Indian foreign policy, a principal objective is to push all multilateral fora to work together so that this comprehensive convention on international terrorism sees the light of day sooner rather than later. From next year, we are going to be a member of the UN Security Council, and certainly our membership of the UN Security Council will place a very high emphasis on this Convention on International Terrorism. I have not so far mentioned 3 important segments of Indian foreign policy, and as I said at the beginning, many aspects of Indian foreign policy deserve separate lectures in themselves. But really, these 3 aspects are our relations with Russia, our relations with the European Union, and our relations with the Eurasian continent as a whole. Now, each of them has a certain space in Indian foreign policy thinking and a certain emphasis which I will not be able to do full justice to in the course of this lecture, except to underline that our relations with the European Union, our relations with Russia are very significant and have and take up a major part of our foreign policy approach and foreign policy thinking. Similarly, there is a great deal of emphasis which is placed on our relations with the United States. One important significant change in the past decade or decade and a half has been this growing India-US relationship, and it encompasses many different aspects. There's the political aspect, there's the strategic aspect, there's the economic aspect, there's a question of technology and intellectual relations. But certainly our relations with the United States are a very significant part also of our foreign policy thinking. I'll come very briefly to our relations with China, because I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. But you're all aware of the developments which have been taking place on our borders with China. This is certainly one of the most serious challenges facing us in recent years. And most unfortunately, there have been casualties on this border after a long period of time, almost 4 decades. The government of India is engaged with China, both through military and diplomatic channels, and it remains firmly committed to resolving all outstanding issues through dialogue. Nevertheless, the rise of China and Chinese assertive behavior has posed a certain set of challenges for Indian foreign policy. And this is, of course, not something which is specific to India, because every foreign office across the world is today discussing the rise of China and the question and the issues this poses for the global order. There are those who speak about a retreat of globalization. There are others who speak about a new hegemon challenging a US dominated world order. And while certainly these are all issues which can be discussed at great length, for us, China is a factor because it is an immediate neighbor. We are not discussing China in an abstract form, or it is not a theoretical construct which we have to come to terms with. It is an immediate neighbor. Like India, it is a civilizational state, and certainly it's the growth of its economy and the emergence of China as a major military power poses issues for us, both on our land borders with China, as also in the fact that we deal with China as a maritime entity throughout. So the issues for us are somewhat different, but at the same time we realize that China is, like all our other neighbors, going to remain our neighbor. So we have to come to arrangements, we have to come to understandings which enable both India and China to grow peacefully as countries which are also civilizations, and that we have to therefore manage our differences and our different approaches so that they do not come in the way of our respective domestic growth. Next year, as I had mentioned, we will be completing, we will be joining the UN Security Council for a 2-year tenure as a non-permanent member. This is also the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. But it is useful to remember that India has a tradition of multilateralism, which is in fact much older than 75 years. We were a founding member of the League of Nations when it was established in 1919, and we were present in its first meeting when it took place in 1920. So this year, in many ways, marks a century of Indian multilateralism. And so when you look at a century of Indian multilateralism in terms of the establishment of the League of Nations, or you look at 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the point is that it is central to our foreign policy thinking that multilateral institutions need to evolve and change. Otherwise, they become ossified and do not meet the requirements of the times. I mentioned the League of Nations consciously and deliberately because it is an example of a multilateral institution which was unable to adapt itself to the changes in the global world order, and therefore in many ways became redundant faced with the emergent geopolitical challenges and geopolitical issues which emerged in the 1930s, like leading to the Second World War from 1939. I think reform of multilateralism is a central plank of Indian foreign policy today. And in that reform of the United Nations Security Council takes up a very large space. India has been at the forefront, has been a major protagonist of those countries which believe that multilateral institutions need to change. The United Nations Security Council can no longer remain frozen in with the architecture that was developed in 1945, because the world since 1945 has changed a great deal. So how the UN Security Council reforms is a central concern for India when it looks at emerging world orders, when it looks at multilateralism, and when it looks at how institutions need to change to adapt themselves to changes in global politics and the global economic situation. I'm also talking to you, as you well know, in the wake of a major pandemic which has disrupted all aspects of our lives, not just in India, but in every country in the world. It will have devastating consequences, economic consequences, and the effects of that will be felt over a period of time. How does this inform Indian foreign policy? I think it strengthens a certain perspective in Indian foreign policy, which always gave a great emphasis to non-traditional security issues, which are issues relating to health, issues relating to equity, issues relating to education, issues relating to climate change, because all of them really are connected with this general crisis which the world has faced today in the form of a pandemic. How do we feel that that these aspects can be further strengthened and further reinforced in the years to come? I think there are 3 or 4 principal elements to this issue. Firstly, the need for non-traditional security issues to move up in the priority list before the world today. I think all of us need to think much more deeply about non-traditional security, such as public health, education, equity, and so on. And this is one principal lesson which the pandemic has taught to us in India today. And I think in the future, in the months to come and in the years to come, we will see India placing a much stronger emphasis on these aspects, apart from traditional geopolitics and so on. Related to this is the issue of climate change, because again, as I said, health security and climate change and ecology and environmental protection are intimately related. When we look at the world's approach to climate change, it is very evident that the narrative has evolved significantly since the 1990s. In Paris in 2015, in the Committee of Parties, our Prime Minister had stressed India's enhanced commitment, and we have thereafter demonstrated our will in terms of our nationally determined contributions and are emerging as a leader in transitions to green energy. We have, for instance, set an ambitious target of achieving about a 40% level of reliance on non-fossil fuel power by 2030. In the near future, we are trying to reach 175 gigawatts in terms of installed capacity in renewable power in about 2 or 3 years. We are deeply committed to expanding our forest cover. All of this really is central to issues of climate change which confront the world today. And my brief point is that I expect that this is an issue which is going to move up in the priority of or in the global priorities, particularly because of the impact which the pandemic has caused. And similarly, it will apply also to issues of public health, education, issues of equity, because equity is very important when we look at how the impact of the vaccine will be felt in different parts of the world in the months to come. When we look at multilateralism, we will also be, it would also be useful to mention that we are going to be, apart from being a member of the UN Security Council from next year, also going to be president of the G20. We are going to have, be the president of BRICS, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And all these platforms will, to my mind, be vehicles for us to push the non-security agenda, which we think is central for global development today. Let me try to wind up by going back to the point I mentioned right at the beginning, that what is the fundamental objective of Indian foreign policy? The fundamental objective of Indian foreign policy is to have an external environment that is conducive to our national development, our internal economic growth, our internal social development, because we are a developing country. We have enormous aspirations to fulfill in terms of giving in terms of meeting the fundamental requirements of a young population. So how we secure an external environment which is conducive to domestic economic growth is the fundamental challenge before us. Here, therefore, our neighborhood has a certain priority, as indeed it does for any other country. The Prime Minister has articulated this priority in terms of calling it neighborhood first. And certainly each of our neighbors has a very high priority in our foreign policy approach and foreign policy thinking. As I said, neighborhood relations are the most challenging before any country's diplomacy, and our own neighborhood poses certain difficult challenges for us, especially when it comes to relations with Pakistan. We are, of course, hopeful that relations will improve, but the fact is that this aspect of terrorism and using terrorism as an instrument of state policy has deeply undermined and eroded whatever initiatives we have taken to try to improve relations with Pakistan. Relations with China, how we try to reach a stable balance with China, how we try to come to an arrangement which will allow both countries to grow peacefully is something which is going to pose a central issue for Indian foreign policy. And here again, it is not as if we are the only country trying to deal with an assertive and a rising China, but certainly our proximity, the fact that we are both large countries with ancient histories, that we are countries as also as our civilizations, does place a certain emphasis on both India and China to try to manage their growths, their respective growths and their aspirations peacefully. Our relations with Russia and the United States and with the European Union will continue to be of great importance and of great significance, as equally how we manage our relations with our other neighbors, to our southwest with the Gulf states, to further to the west with Africa, as indeed with the rest of the world. All of these are going to remain very, very important aspects of Indian foreign policy approaches and thinking. our relations with Southeast Asia and further to the east with Korea, with Japan, are really in the nature of relations which are full of opportunities for both sets of countries. And certainly India's approach to the East is very much in terms of the fact that these are largely relationships which are problem-free in political terms, but certainly have a great deal to offer in terms of cooperation, commercial cooperation, economic cooperation, intellectual cooperation, and cultural cooperation. And here our civilizational links with all the countries to our east is something which forms a bedrock on which modern relationships can be constructed and constantly reinforced and cemented. Let me end on a note again of talking a little bit about South Korea and India. I spoke earlier about the civilizational links which are exemplified by the city of Ayodhya in India, but there are also more modern links which act as powerful cements at the people-to-people level. And I'm referring to Korean pop music and the great impact it has on the younger generation in India, the opportunities which exist for greater economic cooperation between India and South Korea are immense. And I hope that platforms such as this created by the Indian Embassy in Seoul, led by Ambassador Ranganathan, will further reinforce these links and enable stronger relations to emerge, even stronger relations to emerge between our two countries. Thank you very much again for inviting me, and I look forward to the interaction.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, for your fascinating lecture and giving us an overview of the foreign policy prescriptions of Government of India over the years. Very aptly, you have summarized how our foreign policy objectives and orientations have changed over the last 7 decades. Before we open the floor for discussion and invite questions from our participants, we have some very special guests with us today. Let me one by one invite them to comment. Meanwhile, the other participants can prepare their question. May I request Dr. Haksun Paik, who is the president of Sejong Institute. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonu. And my congratulations and thanks to Dr. Raghavan, Indian Council of World Affairs, and Ambassador Ranganathan, and the Indian Embassy in Seoul for this initiative. Giving us a better opportunity to know more and better of modern India. And I cannot agree more with Dr. Raghavan that the principal objective of Indian foreign policy is to secure international environment conducive to domestic economic development. That's something, that is the focus of Indian foreign policy as long as we know. Of course, it is different from South Korea's. We have other issues, security issues, North Korean nuclear issue and peace settlement issue on the peninsula, all of that. And I really appreciate your review and explanation of a very comprehensive picture of principal objective of Indian foreign policy, and also factors that have influence on Indian foreign policy, and region, states, and issues of Indian foreign policy. And I would not speak more to save time for others' questions and answers for you. And I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Ambassador Ranganathan, and also Dr. Raghavan. Just one note. We, Sejong Institute, has a relationship with the Indian Council of World Affairs. Delegation of Sejong Institute visited ICWA, I think 3-4 years ago, and I hope we will continue to do so to strengthen our relationship between two institutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for your comments. And yes, we will try to ensure the relationship that we have with Sejong Institute, which is supposed to be one of the premier institution, one of the premier think tanks of Republic of Korea, focusing on strategic issues. And with these words, let me also invite Ms. Hyunjin Song, who is the director at the Financial News Global Issues Center. Ms. Song, could you please unmute and give your comments?
Thank you, Sana. I'd like to also put on record my appreciation to Ambassador Ranganathan and Dr. Sona Trivedi for organizing this wonderful lecture series on many facets of India. I've been attending this lecture series from from day one, and I've been fascinated by these many facets of India. I've been enjoying this lecture series, and I hope all the attendants have been enjoying this lecture series as much as I have been. And I'd like to also thank Ambassador Raghavan for for giving us an enlightening lecture about India's foreign policy. And I would also like to convey my personal congratulations to India on again assuming the 2-year membership of the UN Security Council from next year. And I do hope, it's my friendly request to our friend India, I do hope India will play a key role in beefing up, reviving the multilateralism that's indulgent at the moment. When you assume, presidency of many important multilateral forums next year. And on China, I cannot emphasize the importance of, or the impact, many impacts of the rise of China has been bringing to the world. Napoleon once said, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world." Okay, with that, as Ambassador Raghavan already mentioned, there have been recent clashes between India and China on the border, and they have been raising tensions between the two countries. I'd like to ask if it has affected the India-China bilateral trade, especially to a significant degree, and the Indian trade overall. In other words, has it made India trying to diversify its exports and import partners, for instance, and also trying to produce more domestically? And do you think the China-India tension will continue to heighten even after the US presidential election into the next year?
Thank you, Ms. Song, for your inputs. Maybe may I request Ambassador Raghavan to please respond. Meanwhile, the other participants, they can prepare their questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Haksoon Paik, for your question and your comment. I look forward to our institutions having detailed interactions in the near future. You're quite right to have mentioned the problems which you face in your neighborhood, especially the security issues with regard to North Korea. I'm reminded of, in India, we think India-Pakistan relations are so bad. There's something exceptional about India and Pakistan, which makes it not possible for them to have a stable relationship. The, the, the point is that neighboring country relationships can often be very difficult. And certainly North and South Korea, or South Korea and Japan, Japan and China. If you look to India's west, between Israel and some of its neighbors, you have currently a situation between Turkey and Greece. You have situation even between Malaysia and Philippines over North Borneo and Sabah. The point is, neighboring country relationships are often very difficult. And and in India, certainly, while you have your own sets of difficulties, in India we have our own difficulties, especially with Pakistan, and especially in terms of how do you try to create a constructive relationship when there is the constant threat of terrorist attacks, and there is also the threat of your neighbor providing a certain sanctuary to terrorist groups. But I think the answer is that while you can change many things in your own country, and maybe global situations will change, the one factor which will not change is your neighborhood. You cannot change your neighbors. And this really is the central dilemma for all countries which face difficult neighboring country relationships. And so thank you very much for that comment, Professor. Thank you also for the second question and comment about China. Yes, I think the rise of China poses numerous questions for all countries. And these are questions which are being debated, as I said, in every foreign office, in every think tank, all over the world. For India, it poses all those questions, but many more, because as I said, China is not something which is one continent away or one ocean away. We are an immediate neighbor. We are next to each other on our land boundaries, and we are also very close to each other in terms of maritime spaces. And as I said, you cannot change your neighborhood. China is going to remain there. India is going to remain here. And we have been, as I said, this is where your civilizational history matters so much. The central issue before China and India is how do we manage our respective growths with least friction. And that really is the challenge for diplomats in both countries. Your question was, has it impacted India-China trade? I think it will have a major impact. The clashes are, the deterioration began only 2-3 months ago, so maybe it's too early to see the impact. But we have seen many impacts already. For instance, the government has banned certain Chinese digital applications because it was suspected that these have certain other impacts also. Because what is very clear is that this will not, if this situation is not managed and it is not controlled and it is not settled to the satisfaction of both parties, it will have an impact on the relationship as a whole. Our relations with China date back to certain initiatives taken by both the governments in the 1980s. And after that, an agreement was reached that we will have peace and tranquility on the border and allow the rest of the relationship to develop. Because of that arrangement, we have China emerging as a major trading partner of India. It is the second largest trading partner. There's been a great deal of economic interactions, commercial interactions. But all of that was premised on the fact that you will have peace and tranquility on the border. If you do not have peace and tranquility, there is no way that the rest of the bilateral relationship will not be affected. And I think this is something which we are trying to explain very much to all our Chinese colleagues and our Chinese friends. But as I said, it is important that both India and China come to arrangements which are stable, which allow both countries to grow and meet their respective aspirations without friction. Now, while there have been serious clashes, it is also a fact that there have been constant contacts both at the political level, at the diplomatic level, and at the military level between India and China. And those contacts are continuing. Our defense minister was in Moscow for a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. Our foreign minister is also going to be there. So these contacts are continuing, and we should be hopeful that some new solution is found. But the short answer to your question, Professor, is yes, it will have an impact. Unless there is peace and tranquility on the border, the rest of the relationship will be severely impacted.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. Could we take some questions? Maybe we can collect some of them and then you can respond to them collectively. May I request Ms. Larissa? And I would request the participants to be very brief and you can introduce yourself. Ms. Larissa?
Yes, thank you very much, Sonu. So the ambassador already partially answered because he said that there are talks between India and China. And actually, I come from Russia, but I don't represent any Russian foreign service or anything. I studied foreign diplomacy at university, but now I'm a totally independent scholar. And actually, I spent 10 years in China, and I witnessed how China suddenly built its military force. And I was very surprised. I think many people were very shocked because the ambassador said today, India is a country that has never conquered anybody. And you know, China 10 years ago was saying exactly the same things. And they were like, we are very peaceful and we always defended ourselves against Western colonizers. And then suddenly within 5 years, maybe they built a huge military force, and it scared myself as well. So I went back home. You know, I was planning to stay in China for a longer time, but then because the military build up, it's also accompanied by nationalism and like very strange. The environment became very, very strange. And so I would like the ambassador, if possible, to comment a little bit more on the Indian position on this LAC, the line of actual control, because actually I was also, at first I thought, wow, it is a great idea because the trend now is that we should have the world without borders. Right? In Europe, the borders were erasing gradually, eroding. And China and India actually never had a border. But now I read on the Chinese newspapers that apparently now China's position is that they want a fixed border. They want a hard border with India, not this line of actual control. And it is all related to Tibet. And internally in China, they cannot discuss Tibet. This word even cannot be written on the Chinese media. So if possible, because India is a little bit more liberal on the freedom of speech, as we discussed yesterday in the media session, I would like the ambassador to comment on the current official position of India on this question of the line of actual control. Thank you very much and sorry for being a little bit long.
Thank you. Thank you, Larissa. May I also request our ambassador, Shripriya Ranganathan, to give her comments?
Thank you so much, sir. I thought that was as expected, that was a fascinating overview of Indian foreign policy. I just wanted to request you, sir, since given you did speak at some length about the issues that many of us face with our neighbors, and that we can choose our friends, but we cannot necessarily choose our neighbors. So we have really no option but to deal with them. So one aspect that I find is very pertinent in terms of our thought process when we think about our relations with our South Asian neighbors. And I find that there is a lot of similarity with what I see here in Korea in terms of North-South relations. We have always found that there is a cultural connect which is underpinning our relations with all our neighbors, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Afghanistan, and so on. And I don't know if you agree, but this was a truism which Ambassador Jain Dikshit had put forth in his book as well. And I remember when we first joined service, there's something that he mentioned to us when we were young officer trainees, that the fundamental problem that we will always face with Pakistan is that Pakistan feels the need to identify itself as being anti-Indian or the antithesis to India, because otherwise everything is so similar. And I see that so much also in the case of Korea, even more so, because in many ways it is one country and they have this aspiration to make it a united country also. Though the two nations are the two parts of Korea are at very different levels of development. They have very different economic models. They have very different political models, but the goal remains the same. Of course, we do not have any more. But I just wanted to ask you if you could reflect a little bit on this angle, because I believe it will be of great interest also to our Korean friends. Thank you so much.
Ambassador Raghavan, you can just respond and later we will take the other round of questions.
Well, thank you for both the questions. To come to the second one first, one of my close friends in Islamabad was Ambassador Song, who was the South Korean ambassador. And we were very good friends, and we would often discuss precisely these issues. And while many people would constantly be asking me that, your relations with Pakistan are so bad. One day, in the midst of one of these discussions, Ambassador Song took me aside and he said, "Ambassador, I really envy you for the relations you have with Pakistan." So I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you do a certain amount of trade with each other. You have people-to-people contact. People come and go. All your television channels can be seen in Pakistan. You access each other's newspapers through the internet. You have some elements of a relationship." Now, this is exactly what I mean. Neighboring country relationships all across the world are very, very difficult. And each one appears to be uniquely bad. But actually, there is a common factor that the real challenge for diplomacy is how you manage neighbors. So as I mentioned, you can look at Greece, Turkey, and if you look at there are explanations for poor relations between Greece and Turkey, which can take you back to the mythical past, the Trojan Wars, to Odysseus and the Iliad. Similarly, you have many other examples of that kind. I think while we can try to look for all kinds of reasons, and there are always those who will believe that there are some things which will never change. I think for diplomats, there is a certain onus on you or on us to be positive about neighboring countries and to try to reach stable arrangements with them. Because in the end, as I said, you cannot change your neighbors. And while you may not have relations which are ever going to be friction-free or problem-free, you can have relations which are more stable. And I think what should drive diplomacy is not the search for perfect solutions, but rather a search for stability. But of course, there are, every country has its own set of issues. And there are many examples: Japan, China, South Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Japan. There are many, many examples: India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Israel and some of its neighbors. There are numerous examples in Latin America and in Africa. So neighboring country relationships are very difficult, but they have to be underwritten by patient diplomacy. There's no answer to that. And we have to try to find stable solutions. But thank you for that question, Ambassador Ranganathan. On the line of actual control, the first question about what is the actual situation. You see, whenever you have neighboring countries and you have borders which are not settled, there is always an element of unpredictability and friction which may come in because of that unpredictability. The Chinese have a view on the India-China border with which really India has no fundamental disagreement. When the Chinese say that the border problem between India and China is a leftover from history, they're quite right. Because these are all, we are dealing with the byproducts of certain colonial interventions. And this is not, again, something which is unique to India and China. There are many other examples. And I was referring earlier to the situation, for instance, between Malaysia and the Philippines over North Borneo and Sabah. It's again very much an outcome of a certain colonial intervention some years ago. And so the Chinese are right when they say that this is a leftover from history. The difficulty which we are facing today is that certain understandings which were reached in the 1980s and 1990s about maintaining peace and tranquility on the border, not changing the status quo unilaterally, that is not being enforced, or we don't see signs of that in the same way as we used to see earlier. And therefore, this then becomes something which is deeply problematic, because as I said, whatever else may have been the main driver in India-China relations, and there was the economic aspect and the commercial aspect, all of it rested on the fact that there had to be peace and tranquility on the border. Now, there are many who believe that this is part of a Chinese, there's a pattern to Chinese assertive behavior. It's not just with India. You have situations in the South China Sea, and you have other situations elsewhere. This is a new Chinese assertive behavior, and it signifies the rise of a new hegemonic aspiration. I think those larger explanations perhaps have merit or not. They have their own place. But for India, we have to view China as an immediate neighbor with which we have lived together for centuries, if not a millennium. And we have to try to find that balance again. It is very clear that unless there is peace and tranquility on that border, we will not be able to find that balance. And therefore, there is an onus both on China as equally on India to try to arrive at some stable agreement.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. Quickly, we will just take some questions from the participants. They have been raising their hands since a long time. May I request Ms. Bahuguna? Ms. Bahuguna, could you please unmute and raise your, ask your question?
Yeah, I'm from Jammu Kashmir Study Center. So my question is, can India expect international support in the eventuality we take back our occupied territories by Pakistan? That is my question. Thank you.
Next, Ms. Sanskriti. Sanskriti.
Good afternoon, sir. It was an amazing session with you, knowing about the foreign policy of India. As I am going to apply for the international studies in my undergraduate course, I want to know about some views about China and like FDI, like foreign direct investment. Are we ready for the increase in the foreign direct investment? Thank you so much, sir, for the session.
Himanshi Bahel. Himanshi Bahel.
Good afternoon. So my question was related to, so you mentioned non-alignment and how that is a core principle of India's foreign policy earlier on. And you even mentioned how these multilateral institutions, they should continue to evolve. So connecting those two dots, do you think non-alignment and NAM as an institution has a role to play in the current situation where US and China are at warheads? Thank you.
Mr. Bhatt? Umesh Bhatt?
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Firstly, I want to thank you for your marvelous lecture. This year, I am going to start my graduation with cybersecurity. As we all know, nowadays cyber attacks are at the peak. So, in your opinion, how could these attacks can be reduced at international level? Thank you.
And just one last question from Mr. Jha. Pinku Jha?
Yeah. Hello, good afternoon. I'm Pinku Jha, I'm from Delhi University. So basically what I have a question that's like there are so many organizations, BIMSTEC, ASEAN, SAARC, these are regional organizations. Even with the bilateral the agreements with other nations are basically related with the trade and culture, social, these issues. But the environment is being neglected from a very long period. So do you think that with the inclusion of India in the UNSC as a non-permanent member, can we, or like even apart from that, that India could initiate some efforts in this field, like environmental issue as a major factor to the foreign policies of our nation and even for the others?
Thank you. Ambassador Raghavan, please, you can take up these questions.
Thank you. Thank you for all these questions. First question is, what will be, how much international support will we have if we take back our occupied territories in Pakistan occupied Kashmir? You see, when we look at, when you talk about international support, the first point to remember always is that just like we have a foreign policy which is suited to our national self-interest, other countries have a policy which is determined by their national interest. It is not determined by your national interests. So countries will see what you do in terms of the impact it will have on them. They will not see it in terms of what you think is right or wrong or what you think is justified or not. They will see it in terms of the impact on them. So in my view, they will see anything which happens in South Asia or in India-Pakistan relations from their own perspective. They won't see it from your perspective. Now, for instance, when you take certain preemptive steps because of a terrorist threat you face, like you undertake certain actions across the LOC, which you called surgical strikes, or you took certain steps after the terrorist attack on Pulwama, you were able to tell the international community that I had to do this because I face a terrorist threat. And on the whole, on the issue of terrorism, countries are supportive because they understand the nature of the problem. They understand Pakistan's long history and association with terrorist groups. So you are able to show them that why you had to take these steps because of internal security, because of reasons to do with your security. Now, on the other hand, if you say I'm going to do something which will, because it is my right and because there is a justification and because my territory is under illegal occupation, you will have to convince them that why more instability in South Asia is something they should support. Now, every country will have a different view on this. Many countries will feel that why is India disturbing the status quo? If it has accepted this situation for 50, 60 years, why should it disturb the situation right now? Other countries may see it from a different perspective depending on their own relations with Pakistan. Nobody sees an issue in the same way as you see it. You may see the issue very clearly in terms of your natural right, in terms of right and wrong, but other countries will see that issue in terms of their own interests. So I think this is how foreign policy is conducted. The second question was about China and investments from China. I think there is no doubt that China's economic growth has created a great deal of opportunities for all its neighbors. It has also created challenges for all its neighbors. And in India, we have many opportunities because you are able to get goods at much lower prices than you were otherwise purchasing from other countries in the world. At the same time, you have the problem of your trade imbalance being heavily weighted against you. Now, these are questions which always come up when you start integrating and you start having a great deal of economic interactions with countries which you were otherwise not having much to do with. The same issue applies with regard to investments. There is a question of whether FDI from China is a way of balancing the negative trade balance you have with China. It's a good question. But I think in the current situation, those questions will be only discussed with in depth after there is some semblance of stability on the border. Because we cannot expect to go on having a economic relationship with China, which is forward-looking and dynamic, when on the border situations do not stabilize. I don't think those two things can happen together. The third question was about non-alignment. Yes, I think a certain sense of non-alignment remains as a kind of bedrock or undercurrent in Indian foreign policy thinking. And that sense of non-alignment now really is expressed not so much in terms of non-alignment, but rather in terms of strategic autonomy or strategic freedom, or choosing what is in our interest rather than going along because of any predisposition towards one country or the other. So I think this tradition of non-alignment has transformed itself into a tradition of strategic autonomy. Non-alignment came into existence because of the Cold War. You wanted to have equidistance between the two opposing powers in the Cold War, and you tried to give it a policy perspective by calling it non-alignment. I think those days are over. The Cold War is over. You don't have those opposing forces in the way you used to. The geopolitical situation now is different. But certainly the legacy of non-alignment remains with us, and that is in our approach of strategic autonomy. The fourth question was about cybersecurity. I missed part of it. There was some audio. But yes, cybersecurity is very important because we are moving, technology is changing the way in which foreign policy is being conducted. And that is because of fast-paced technological change means that it occurs in areas where there are no rules, there are no regulators, and particularly so because there are no international regimes. So you are moving further and further very quickly into gray areas where international law and international regimes have not yet been constructed. And therefore, how you manage your own, how you set up, how you establish your own terms of reference so that you're not threatened by these developments. And cybersecurity, yes, is very, very important in that aspect. I had referred to certain Chinese apps being banned, and really that is really part of your cybersecurity approach to these new emergent issues. The fifth question was on environment and why we don't have why we don't have regional arrangements with regard to environment. It's a good question. I think the answer lies in two parts. Firstly, because climate change is a global phenomenon, you cannot disaggregate it and look at it only regionally. So you cannot have a climate change policy for South Asia without a climate change policy which is global. You cannot address, let's say, rising ocean levels or rising sea levels or issues of that kind only on a regional basis, because in the end, all regional constructs are artificial. When you look on it, all regional constructs are artificial, and they are the results of changes which happened at a global level from the 1930s and 1940s onwards. Climate change, ocean level rise, glacial melt, these are all global phenomena. You cannot easily come to practical solutions at a sub-global level. The second thing is that it's easier to do some things at a global level than at a regional or at a bilateral level. Because when you try to do things at a regional level, many issues acquire a greater prominence than they would if it were done at a global level. For instance, if you look at issues to do with ocean level rise, you cannot do it at a regional level because all kinds of issues will come up, which is of maritime boundaries, what is the EEZ of a particular country, all those unresolved issues then come in the way. So instead of addressing the central climate change issue, you start addressing traditional geopolitical issues. And there are many issues of this kind in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Therefore, some things are much more easily done at a global level so that the regional divisive issues or the bilateral divisive issues get subsumed or suppressed and don't have the same prominence.
Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, for taking up all the questions and being so generous with the time. It's been almost more than 1 hour, 40 minutes. Many thanks for your time and taking up the questions and for your brilliant lecture and sharing your deep insights on India's foreign policy. For wrapping up, may I request my colleague, Mr. Swapnil Thorat, who is the head of the Public Diplomacy Wing at Embassy of India, Seoul, to summarize and give the formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Swapnil.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an engaging talk on Indian foreign policy. From this talk, we can very well understand that in today's era, foreign policy is not only confined to conventional subjects, but it has become much more dynamic. It deals with security issues, health-related issues, education, climate change, etc. So this urges all of us to understand this subject in a much more detailed way. During his talk, Ambassador Raghavan summarized principal objective of India's foreign policy. He also gave an overview of factors which are responsible for shaping of our foreign policy, which may be diversity or our geographical location, India's history, especially phase of our freedom struggle. Sir has also very briefly covered few major events involving countries in our neighborhood, which designed our relationship with those countries as the time has changed. As Sir said in the very beginning, for a topic like continuity and change in Indian foreign policy, we will need a separate seminar or a lecture series. But he has very well summarized an overall evolution in our foreign policy in a very short span of a time. His talk has helped all of us here to get a basic understanding about how our foreign policy has taken shape in a timely manner. On behalf of Embassy of India and Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center, I would like to thank Ambassador Raghavan for accepting this invitation of this workshop and for engaging interaction with all the participants. Thanks to all participants, especially our Korean friends, for attending this talk with enormous enthusiasm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sonu, and thank you, Ambassador, for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for your time.